It was a quiet morning in the small town of Maple Hollow, the kind of place where folks still wave at each other from their porches and where time seems to move just a little slower. The pine trees that surrounded the town stood tall and still that day, their tops swaying softly against a pale sky. You could almost smell the damp earth and hear the creek running just beyond the hill. They were all gathered for a funeral, one that meant something to everyone there. Walter Griggs had passed away at 72. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was one of those men a small town doesn't forget. A logger all his life, Walter had worked these woods for more than 5 decades. Strong, fair, quiet. The kind of man who'd rather fix something than throw it away, and who'd never speak more words than were needed. That morning, people came from every corner of town. Old friends, neighbors, the sheriff, even the store clerk, all standing around a simple wooden casket beneath the shade of pine branches. The old hilltop cemetery overlooked the forest Walter loved so much. The air felt calm, respectful. Maybe too calm. You could sense something heavy, though no one said a word. The pastor spoke softly and a few people wept. Then, just as the wind died down, something shifted. A sound, faint and distant, like a branch breaking somewhere beyond the tree line. At first, no one paid attention. But I remember looking toward those woods, and for some reason my chest tightened. Whatever it was that moved out there, I knew even then. I'd never forget what came next. The priest began to speak, his voice steady and low, carrying through the cool morning air. A few sniffles broke the silence as people wiped their eyes. The old pine trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches whispering above the crowd, almost as if the forest itself was listening. Walter's daughter, Martha, stood near the casket, clutching a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to read. Her voice cracked on the first few words, but she kept going. She spoke about her father's simple ways, how he loved the woods more than anything, how he'd disappear for hours just to listen to the trees, as he used to say. She talked about his kindness, how he once rescued an injured owl and nursed it back to health, and how he never took more from the land than he needed. Her words hit hard. You could feel it in the air. That deep shared ache of losing someone who had quietly shaped the heart of the town. Even the breeze seemed to pause for her. Then it happened. A faint crack, sharp and sudden, echoing from the edge of the forest. Heads turned. The priest stopped mid-sentence. Another snap followed, louder this time, like a heavy step over dry twigs. For a moment, no one moved. Every face turned toward the trees bordering the cemetery. The wind stilled completely. The silence that followed was thick, uneasy. Someone near the back whispered, "Probably a deer." A few nodded, trying to believe it. But then, from between the dark trunks, something stirred. A figure, tall and wide-shouldered, slowly stepped out of the shadows. Gasps broke the quiet. The priest lowered his Bible. Martha froze, her paper slipping from her hand. What emerged from those trees was no deer. The figure took one slow, deliberate step out of the tree line, then another. Sunlight caught on its fur, thick, dark brown with streaks of silver running across its shoulders and arms. It stood upright, towering over everyone there, at least 8 feet tall. Built like something that didn't belong in this world, yet somehow fit perfectly into the forest behind it. No one screamed. No one ran. It was as if the entire crowd had forgotten how to breathe. The priest's hand trembled, his Bible lowering to his side. Even the wind seemed to vanish. The pines stood still, their needles frozen mid-sway. The creature, Bigfoot, though no one dared whisper the word yet, paused at the edge of the clearing. His chest rose and fell slowly, heavily. Across that broad chest, a long, faded scar ran from shoulder to rib, the mark of an old wound. But it wasn't the size or the power of the creature that struck everyone silent. It was his eyes. They were dark amber, deep, almost human, and filled with something that none of them expected: sadness. He didn't snarl or move forward in aggression. Instead, he looked toward the casket, his head tilting slightly as though recognizing the man within. He took one more step, stopping a respectful distance from the grave. The sound of his breathing was faint but heavy, the only sound in the air. Not even a bird chirped. For a long moment, no one dared move. Martha's hand gripped her brother's arm tightly. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Dad told me," she said, trembling. "He once saw that thing. years ago near the creek, said it wasn't mean, just watching. The creature stood motionless, his gaze never leaving the casket. His massive head bowed slowly, almost reverently. It wasn't the posture of a beast. It was the gesture of someone paying respect. The people didn't know what to do. Fear mixed with something else entirely. It didn't feel like an intrusion or a threat. It felt personal. As strange as it sounded, it felt like a goodbye. For a long moment, the creature didn't move. Then, with a low, almost weary breath, he stepped closer. Just a few paces, his massive feet pressing deep into the earth. The sound of it was heavy, deliberate, like the weight of time itself settling into the soil. When he stopped beside the grave, the crowd instinctively stepped back. The priest froze in place. Martha's knees nearly gave out, but something in her heart told her not to run. She just stood there, eyes wide, watching. The creature slowly bent one knee. The motion was stiff, careful, almost human. The ground trembled as he lowered himself. His large hand, rough, covered in matted fur, pressed into the soft soil, leaving a deep print beside the grave. Then, from his other hand, he set something down. It was a small bundle, pine cones, wildflowers, and thin strips of bark tied neatly together like a handmade offering. The flowers were freshly picked, still damp with dew. Someone gasped. A few people began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from something deeper. Confusion, awe, maybe even understanding. The creature remained still for a moment, head lowered, massive shoulders rising and falling with each breath. It was unmistakable. He was mourning, paying respect. Martha's trembling hand moved to her chest. Tears filled her eyes as she took a step forward, her voice barely audible. "Thank you," she whispered. The creature lifted his head slightly. For the first time, his eyes met hers, glistening in the morning light. There was no anger, no wildness, just sorrow. He stayed like that for a heartbeat longer, as if acknowledging her words, then turned. Slowly, silently, he rose to his full height and began walking back toward the trees. Each step felt heavy but certain, like a man leaving a graveside he didn't want to leave. The crowd stood frozen, watching as the dark figure vanished between the pines. Not a single bird sang. Not a single voice spoke. When the last trace of him was gone, Martha looked at the bundle he'd left and whispered through her tears. He remembered him. No one moved for a full minute. The silence of the forest, pressed in, not threatening, not eerie, just deeply painfully human. The funeral went on, but the mood had changed completely. The priest's hand still trembled as he read the final prayer, and his voice wavered more than once. People bowed their heads, but their minds were elsewhere, still caught in the image of that massive figure kneeling beside Walter Griggs' grave. No one talked for a while. Even when the ceremony ended, the usual whispers and condolences were missing. Folks simply drifted away in silence, glancing back toward the woods as they left. It was as if every one of them was afraid to break whatever strange peace had just settled there. By that evening, word had already spread across town. Some called it a sign. Others said it was an omen, though no one could say of what. A few doubted what they saw, but not many. There were too many witnesses, too many honest faces repeating the same details. The height, the dark fur, the way it bowed its head. Sheriff Dale, a man not easily rattled, went around asking questions. He found over 20 people who swore on their lives that the creature meant no harm. "Didn't seem angry," one said. "Didn't seem wild," said another. He looked sad. That word came up over and over. Sad. It wasn't long before the stories about Walter began to resurface. Old friends remembered things he'd said years ago. Down at Miller's Diner, an old logger named Tom Peters told the sheriff something that made everyone stop talking. "I remember Walter telling me this. Must have been 30 years ago," Tom said, staring into his coffee. "He was out cutting near Pine Creek when he found something pinned under a fallen pine. Said it was big, but not a bear, not a man, something in between. He swore it looked him right in the eye. Hurt, scared, and human somehow." Tom paused, shaking his head. Walter said he cut the log loose and the thing limped off without a sound. He never forgot those eyes. After that story spread, people began to see the funeral in a different light. The flowers, the bow, the quiet presence. It all started to make sense. They began to believe that the creature hadn't just appeared by chance. He'd come back to repay a debt of kindness from long ago, and in a strange way, that thought brought the whole town a quiet sort of comfort. A week passed before Martha found the courage to visit her father's grave again. The days had been still and gray, the kind of weather that makes everything feel slower, quieter. She carried a small bouquet of daisies, Walter's favorite, and walked the familiar hill path that wound through the pines. The cemetery was empty when she arrived. Only the sound of the creek below broke the silence. The grass around the grave was still slightly disturbed from the burial, but something else caught her eye right away. There were flowers there already. Not hers. Wild ones, fresh, bright, and damp with morning dew. They were arranged neatly, not scattered by the wind. Sprigs of pine, small yellow blooms, and a few ferns tied together with a strip of bark. Martha froze, her breath catching in her chest. She knelt down and ran her fingers across the soft petals. They were new, no more than a day old. And then she saw them, footprints, large, deep impressions in the earth coming straight from the tree line. The prints were spaced far apart. Whatever had made them was tall, heavy. They stopped just at the edge of the grave, turned slightly, and then disappeared back toward the forest. But Martha didn't feel fear. Not anymore. A strange calm washed over her. The same kind of peace she used to feel when her father would quietly sit beside her on the porch at sunset, saying nothing, just being there. She placed her bouquet beside the wildflowers and whispered softly, "He remembered you, Dad." The wind stirred, carrying with it a low, distant sound, not quite a growl, not quite a call. It was soft, mournful, and gone as quickly as it came. Martha looked toward the trees, her eyes wet with tears, but her lips curved into a small, trembling smile. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "You both did." Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and walked back down the hill, leaving behind 2 sets of flowers on one grave, one from a daughter, and one from a friend her father never forgot. Time moved on as it always does, and Maple Hollow slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The chatter at the diner faded. The shot gave way to reflection, and the forest, that deep, endless green wall beyond the cemetery, went back to its patient silence. But something had changed. No one called it a monster anymore. Folks stopped whispering stories of fear and danger. Instead, they spoke with a kind of reverence, like remembering a solemn visitor who had come with purpose. Sheriff Dale eventually stopped taking statements. The priest, who once doubted what his own eyes saw, later said during Sunday service, "Maybe God sends reminders in forms we don't expect." Spring turned to summer, and one morning Martha climbed the hill again. There, at the foot of her father's grave, lay a new bundle of wildflowers, fresh, tied with bark, placed neatly in the same spot as before. No one saw who left them. No one needed to. Year after year, the same thing happened. Every season, without fail, wildflowers appeared on Walter Griggs' grave. Never store-bought, always from the forest. It became quiet tradition for folks passing by to stop and look, not in fear, but in respect. The story of that day turned into something different over time. No longer a tale of shock or disbelief, but one of understanding. The old-timers told it to their grandchildren not as a mystery, but as a lesson that kindness once given never truly disappears, and sometimes the ones we least expect remember it the longest. In the end, there was no denying what had happened, because too many good people had seen it with their own eyes. As the narrator's voice softens, the camera of memory settles once more on that quiet grave beneath the pines. We think we know the boundaries of life and death, of man and beast, the voice says, but sometimes kindness travels farther than we can imagine. Then a final pause, a breath of wind through the trees. "He didn't come to scare us," the voice concludes. "He came to say goodbye to the only man who ever treated him like he was human."